Iran has urged the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, not to be influenced by certain countries' political objectives. Iran's spokesperson made the remarks, during which she also hinted at the upcoming visit of Rafael Grossi, head of the IAEA, to Iran, saying, quote, "I hope this trip would be constructive like the previous ones." In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at present and previous instances where the IAEA has given in to pressure when it came to Iran's nuclear file, and if this time around it would act more constructively. First, let's talk to Press TV's Homolesky, who joins us from Vienna. So this upcoming talk, you've had Iran make some statements. Iran has obviously its own concerns when it comes to the IAEA and how it has politicized by becoming more involved than its boundaries. Can you explain how that has been the case?
Yes, of course. Let's just see what the issue right now is. You know that the agency has said that since late February 2021, the amount of access that the agency has had to Iran's facilities has been dramatically reduced. But this has nothing to do, of course, with the safeguards-related commitments that Iran has. This just means verification and monitoring of Iran's JCPOA-related commitments. That's, of course, because the status of the JCPOA hangs in the balance. We don't know how it's going to turn out, and Iran, based on its own internal laws, decided to restrict some of the access, unprecedented access that it had given to the agency. What the agency is now concerned about, and it has said it's concerned about, is the continuity of knowledge. So it's saying that if and when the JCPOA is back in place, the agency would have to, of course, continue this verification and monitoring work. And in this stage, it needs to be able to know what is happening in order to have that continuity of knowledge. But as you said there are complaints raised by the Iranian side when it comes to attempts, they say, by certain countries, the US, the Europeans, sometimes named directly, for trying to sway the IAEA or turn it into a political organization or influence decisions that are being made by the IAEA. These include, for instance, leaking of confidential documents that have been supplied by Iran, the fact that their agency stops from directly condemning Israel for sabotage attempts and attacks against Iranian facilities, and also putting on the agenda what Iran says are unsubstantiated allegations against its nuclear program, and creating a political fire when it comes to Iran's activities. These are just some of the issues that I'm quickly pointing to. But of course, this visit that Mr. Grossi is going to have coming just ahead of the IAEA board session on Iran and the upcoming talks on the JCPOA, a lot of people are saying how Mr. Grossi assesses this visit is going to directly impact the atmosphere and the trajectory of both the IAEA board session and the JCPOA talks.
Okay, thank you for that. Press TV's Homolesky there from Vienna. Many thanks. Joining us for this edition of the Spotlight, we have historian and investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who joins us from Bristol. Also joining us, writer and political analyst John Wight, who joins us from Edinburgh. Okay, Tony Gosling, let me start with you here and get your reaction to what the spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry has said. He has called on the International Atomic Energy Agency not to allow certain countries to abuse its name for the sake of achieving their own political objectives. Whom or to what is he referring to?
Well, look, it's quite obvious in something as sensitive as atomic energy that the International Atomic Energy Authority is basically walking a tightrope. So it's really, really difficult for them to please everybody, probably impossible. So they do have to look into, say, for example, if the Israelis give them allegations that they say that there is evidence that the Iranians have broken various agreements, then they have to look into those, however much they may not necessarily believe them. And so, you know, they have to show to the whole world that they're trying to be even-handed. Having said that, you know, they are, as many other organisations across the world, not least of which is FIFA for football, you know, and the athletics organisations and the United Nations itself are being fought over. So these organisations, there are attempts to create coups within them in order to take them over generally for the to push the influence of the West. Mainly, I think the West has been most proactive in trying to sabotage these organisations and take them over, infiltrate them, etc. And also we get a lot of spin here in the West. So, for example, the IAEA say things like, we've had very good relations with the Iranians over the years. Then that will not be reported, I'm afraid, anywhere in the West because it's a positive comment about Iran. So the International Atomic Energy Authority has got a really difficult job to do here, not only in showing both sides, in fact all sides, that it's prepared to take everything, any evidence that they give seriously, but also in trying to keep its own independence. I mean, that's one of the most difficult things. And we've seen, for example, with the UN as well, that people with lots of money can come along and say, "Hi, UN, hi, IAEA, we can help you out with a great deal because we know you haven't got much money," and then, of course, that's when the problems can often begin. So I actually feel quite sorry for the IAEA. They've got such a difficult job to do here. In Vienna, I think we've got an even more difficult task, which is to make sure that this 2015 JCPOA is re-signed. And it's not just a piece of paper.
Sure.
Let's start at the beginning, because it's the most important piece of paper on the planet, I'm afraid, and that is because it is stopping any kind of progress towards a Middle East war between Israel and Iran, which Israel is likely to start if it happens, and of course Israel is a nuclear-armed country. So that's why this piece of paper is so important.
I see. Well, let's see here. John Wight, to use the words of Tony Gosling, the IAEA is pretty much walking a tightrope. It has to show a balanced approach when it comes to this. Do you think that the IAEA has used a balanced approach? And do you agree with how many have said that Iran's nuclear case has been politicized by the IAEA and that it has been influenced?
Well, indeed, good evening. The growing crisis within the larger crisis is our questions over the legitimacy of organisations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency and its sister organisation, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, vis-à-vis Syria. And so until those questions are resolved, countries and governments that exist without the US/Western orbit, such as Iran, such as Syria, such as China, such as Russia, such as Venezuela, etc., have just cause to question the actions of the IAEA and to lose confidence in its ability to act as a neutral arbiter in these very, very serious matters. And indeed, these organisations are being corrupted by the huge pressure being placed upon them by Western governments, especially the US government, which is trying desperately to hold on to its hegemonic status in the world. And so this is the growing crisis within the larger crisis, and until the smaller crisis is resolved, the larger crisis cannot be resolved.
It's very odd to use, for lack of a better way of describing this, Tony Gosling, when you take a look at why Israel comes and tries to present a case against Iran when the facts prove otherwise when it comes to the inspection that the IAEA has done on Iran's nuclear facilities, with Israel not a party to the NPT and not open to IAEA inspections or any type of inspections of its nuclear facilities. Do you agree?
Well, yes, of course, it's hypocritical. And I think it's also worth reiterating, and I'm afraid the IAEA and the media in the West here don't seem to take much notice of the fact that the Iranian state has issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons, which is saying that these could not be justified in use at all because they would bring in so many innocent casualties. So many innocent people would die were they to be used, as of course we've seen when they've been used in anger at the end of the Second World War in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States, who, it must be said, did not really need to use those weapons at the time. And so it's rather rich for the United States to be saying that the Iranians and to start trying to cast judgment around the world about who can and cannot use nuclear weapons when they used them without really a justified cause back in 1945 to kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese people. So this is, of course, a very important again, a very important edict issued by Iran, saying that there is a religious fatwa against nuclear weapons, because if the Iranians secretly were to be manufacturing nuclear weapons, they would be going against their own faith, their own republic, etc. And they're very unlikely to be doing that, and they would be basically shooting themselves in the foot, so to speak. So there are all sorts of aspects to this which do not sit very well in the international media, which is very biased towards the United States. And I think it's also worth pointing out that we've got a very, I don't talk about the prospect of war and nuclear war in the Middle East lightly, because we have in the United States and in Great Britain a very, very powerful Israel lobby, which is incredibly well funded. We had an Al Jazeera program a couple of years ago which showed the extent to which the Israel lobby in London and the political attaché, Shai Massot, was prepared to use hundreds of thousands and even millions of pounds to bribe his way into the Conservative Party, into the Labour Party, and he even succeeded in having Alan Duncan, who was a defence minister, removed from his job. Who was pro-Palestinian. So we've got a very, very powerful behind-the-scenes Israel lobby in the United States and Britain, and actually in many other countries in Europe too. So that makes this much more urgent, because, of course, the Israelis know that they could only get away with a preemptive strike or a false flag attack with a nuclear weapon or such sort of thing if they had some sort of backup within the European powers and the United States. So we've slowly but surely moved towards a potential hair trigger here, and that's why this piece of paper being signed, the JCPOA, is so important, and why the IAEA has to do a balanced job. To be quite honest, I am not sure as to the latest developments with the IAEA, whether it's being balanced or not, but I've seen in the past that they have made statements which seem to be against the Iranians. But I think with something so important, we've got to be very careful about pointing the finger at the IAEA right now.
Well, let's use an example of whether the IAEA has been balanced or not. I'm going to zoom in on Rafael Grossi here. John Wight, in an interview with AFB, he claimed that the agency had no contact with the new Iranian administration to discuss some issues related to Iran's nuclear program. Now, that goes against the frequent contacts that it has had with Iran's permanent mission and acting representative to the international organizations in Vienna over the past months. Is Rafael Grossi being influenced here? Is he being directed?
Well, of course he is. This is about hard power politics. We keep hearing the term the rules-based international order. That's bunkum. That's for the consumption of the masses. It's all about hard power. Stalin said it best, with the clear-eyed logic of which only dictators are capable. How many divisions does the Pope have? This is what this is all about. It's about maintaining an imbalance of power on the world stage between the West and its allies and those who are running counter to the Western hegemonic agenda. And so the US administration under Biden has proved less to be the change candidate that he promised on the world stage and more a continuity candidate, more trying to continue the Trump agenda, using these upcoming talks in Vienna to try and leverage concessions from Iran that have nothing whatsoever to do with Iran's nuclear program, but everything to do with the regional agendas of the Saudis and the Israelis. That's what this is all about. Until you understand that, you understand nothing about what's going on in the world today, especially vis-à-vis Iran and its dealings with the US and its allies on the world stage.
We're looking here at the upcoming talks with P4+1, Tony Gosling, for the lifting of sanctions that is going to happen. The Board of Governors is going to take place in a matter of days. And, of course, you have the Rafael Grossi who's going to visit Tehran. And mind you, based on my last question, when Grossi made that statement, he visited Iran on November 22nd, and he said, I've had no contacts with with the new administration. How is this going to affect the talks with the P4+1 for the lifting of sanctions in the assessment that the IAEA makes on Iran?
Well, that sort of statement, I'm afraid, is very difficult to believe, isn't it? And, of course, if the IAEA are going to come out with statements like that, then I'm afraid it reduces their credibility. And, you know, we've seen over the years, haven't we, that there's been all sorts of inspections, including those in Iraq, by people like Scott Ritter during the run-up to the illegal 2003 Iraq war, where nations have opened up their countries to inspections, international inspections, and then found that welcoming and honest attitude abused by the West. So it's, I think, very good that the Iranians have made sure that their doors are open to the IAEA, but I think it, of course, makes sense to be quite suspicious of them, particularly, as I say, because we have a momentum building, I believe, for some sort of conflict to go on in the Middle East. I mean, this has really been brewing ever since I first started as a journalist back in 1990 with the first Gulf War, with the massive intervention in Kuwait, and which was really just a trick, wasn't it? Where the Americans conned, using their ambassador April Glasby, conned Saddam into thinking, oh, well, if you go into Kuwait, the Americans won't do anything. So these, I'm afraid, people remember these confidence tricks by the US diplomats, and they realise that actually what's going on at the heart of this is something much, much deeper. A real interest, I mean, what we're looking at, I believe, today is something as gross as the medieval Crusades, a Western and a European, and of course the Americans weren't around in the original Crusades, but the Europeans most certainly were, and they managed to fail to get hold of the Middle East through their Knights Templar and the Crusaders back in medieval times. I think they're having a second go to try and control the Middle East. And of course, there are many Arab countries, not least of which are the poor Palestinians who are suffering under this, who would like to see them out. But many of those Arab countries, including the Gulf states, of course, are now really in bed with the Israelis and the Americans. So we have a very, very dodgy situation, a dangerous situation that's developed. And the JCPOA and the IAEA round has to go well in order to make sure that everyone can sleep easily in their beds at night, knowing that we're not going to get some news in the morning saying there's been a massive conflagration going on between Iran and Israel, or Israel and Syria, etc. And of course, that sort of conflict would drag in the superpowers, and that's why I think it's most important for people around the world to realise is it wouldn't just be a localised concern, because Russia, of course, and the United States have got big interests in the region. They wouldn't just allow a little fight. Well,
it wouldn't be Iran doing the offensive moves here, because Israel not only has attacked Syria, John Wight, on repeated occasions. You're looking at the fact that it has sabotaged Iran's nuclear facilities, including the most recent attack on Karaj. I'd like to point out to you, John Wight, this header from an Israeli periodical, which says U.S. officials warned Israel attacks on Iranian nuke facilities are counterproductive. It just came out today. It says Israeli officials reportedly dismissed U.S. warnings that attempts to slow down Iran's nuclear program with sabotage are causing Iran to speed it up. What do you think about this headline?
Well, it's a drumbeat to war, isn't it? That drumbeat is sounding ever louder. It's emanating from Tel Aviv. Israeli officials will see that Biden administration is historically weak, and they're trying to bend it to its will. They'll be coming up with all sorts of false intelligence to try and make the case for airstrikes, for attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. This has been ongoing for quite some time. Netanyahu was obsessed with the Iranians. Unfortunately, he was not able to make that case sufficiently to pass muster with the Pentagon, although Trump probably was keen to go ahead and carry out such airstrikes, given that he was a man who was very much influenced by vanity and by appearing popular and a strong man on the world stage. But it depends on how firm the Pentagon holds against this agenda. There will be various voices within the Pentagon who will be gung-ho for such an airstrike, others that will be opposed to it. So there's a lot of tension taking place within security, military circles in the US, but we do know that the Biden administration is not in any position to withstand pressure from the Israelis and the Saudis beyond a certain point. Domestically, it's very weak. It's consumed with culture wars at home, and it's unable to carry out the agenda that it came into power promising to carry out. This ultimately is going to be a litmus test for the Russians, the Chinese, and the European powers. What they do in the next few weeks and months will determine the fate of the world. I don't say that lightly. We are at historical crossroads when it comes to the future of the world, and the Iranians are holding for them, because this is not about any supposed crimes or any supposed activities the Iranians are undertaking to undermine the Middle Eastern stability. It's all about the Israelis and, to a lesser extent, the Saudis. Israel is a rogue state, and until the world wakes up to that fact, then there will never be security, not only in the Middle East, but in the world entire as a consequence.
So if we have reached that point, do you think then, Tony Gosling, that the IAEA report and the Board of Governors and its assessment on Iran is going to be free and void of any exaggerations when it comes to Iran?
Look, I would very much doubt that, actually. And look, we've got many flawed organisations. The IAEA is flawed. The United Nations is flawed, particularly the Security Council. The BBC is flawed, very flawed. My old employer, but they're all we've got, and so we have to try and work with these organisations. Whilst there is a shred of integrity left in them, we've got to work with them, I believe. I think it's also worth pointing out that the United States did not just leave the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. They also imposed sanctions. They didn't need to do that. They could have left the deal and then attempted to renegotiate it, but they did a double whammy. They started to impose these sanctions, which they didn't just impose from the United States. They also started to take to court countries all around the world that continued to deal with Iran and basically threaten and bully those countries, including these big aircraft manufacturers like Airbus, saying, well, if you supply, this is European, if you supply Iran with goods, we are going to boycott you. And so this was a very pernicious thing that Trump did, and it's going to take a lot of putting back together again.
Sure.
But it's probably one of the most important jobs on the planet. And I would also point out that what's been going up in Glasgow at COP26 and much of this climate agenda has taken away a lot of attention from this much more important issue, in my view.
All right, we're going to unfortunately have to leave it there. Let me thank you there, Tony Gosling from BRISTOL, historian and investigative journalist, and from Edinburgh, John Wight. Thank you, writer and political analyst. And at the top of the spotlight, we had our correspondent, Homolesky, who gave us an update from Vienna. With that, we come to an end for this edition of the Spotlight. From Miko Watagwe and the entire team, it's goodbye. Until next time.